everyone, and welcome to today's episode of The Fragrance Report, a podcast where we talk about all things fragrance. I'm your host, Anya, and in today's episode, we're going to be exploring Hollywood icons from old Hollywood to present day and their influence on the fragrance industry, from endorsements to their own brands and fragrance lines, and also doing a little bit of an evaluation about what constitutes a successful endorsement and successful association with a fragrance, and what constitutes as something a little bit disingenuous. We're going to be touching on that today, but if this is your first time listening to this podcast, let me introduce myself. I'm Anya. I love fragrances. I am primarily on YouTube, but I also do content on Instagram and TikTok under the username ANECHKAFRAGRANCES. And I created this podcast to be able to talk about fragrances in greater detail, and we have a new episode of this podcast launch every Wednesday. As always, I want to share with you the fragrances I've been enjoying over this past week. I've really been loving Naughty Nona, which is kind of like this really beautiful vanilla fragrance. It's inspired by fruitcake, and today I decided to layer it with Otimo. Otimo is a beautiful boozy tobacco fragrance. It also has vanilla facets in it as well, and these fragrances combined together is such a winning combination. They're both stunning, but they're also quite different. Naughty Nona is more of a traditional gourmand. Otimo is more of an elevated, boozy, unisex fragrance, but combined, this was a really interesting and winning combination that I did appreciate. I also filmed a video this past week talking about leather fragrances, and inspired by that content, I was wearing a lot of leather fragrances kind of like in my personal life, and one that I have been putting on the back burner but I got reintroduced to was Lease of True Minds. This is a really interesting take on a soft suede-like leather fragrance with some soft spiciness, and it's a perfume that does stay quite close to the skin. But if you're a beginner to leather and fragrances and you want something that's approachable and unique, this is a really good one to try. This is Lease of True Minds. And I also did another video talking about quiet luxury fragrances, and one of those fragrances was Magnetic Monaco by Viage. I've been wearing this a lot. It's a slightly spiced white floral fragrance with some muskiness. Love this one. This was like my work from home go-to fragrance. I've been spraying this one on a lot. And then I also have been loving this fragrance by Liquide Imaginaire. This is Bloody Wood. I've mentioned it many times. This is a really interesting take on rose with some red wine, fruity notes, and cherry, as well as raspberry. This is inspired by wine, but it does have kind of like a sparkling wine quality to it that I really, really love. But I will say, whenever I pick this one up, I always reach for the top, and it's kind of like this interesting design, like where the cap is really heavy, but the cap always comes off when I pick it up, and I always get scared that I'm going to break the bottle, which would be a nightmare for me because I love this fragrance so much. But Bloody Wood, this is also a fragrance that I've really been enjoying. It's one of those cozy fragrances for the wintertime. It does kind of dry down after a few hours and it becomes a skin scent, but I love the way this is smelling, so I really don't mind that. So let's get into the substance of this episode and start talking about some old Hollywood icons and their approach to fragrances, and then we're going to explore some modern day icons a little bit as well. But I do want to take the time to introduce you to some of my favorite old Hollywood starlets and explore how they influenced the fragrance industry. So of course, one of the huge stars of the 1950s and 60s was Marilyn Monroe. She was an absolute icon, and what's interesting is she was one of the first people to really endorse a fragrance, and her endorsement came in the form of an interview where she just did a typical Hollywood interview. They asked her, what do you wear to bed? Because she was a sex symbol at the time. And of course, they were going to ask her a question like that. And because she didn't want to say that she slept nude, she decided to say just a few drops of Chanel No. 5. And Chanel No. 5 just happened to be a fragrance that she really loved and appreciated. It had been around for a very long time at that point. And that remark basically catapulted Chanel No. 5 into iconic status. because previously to that, it had already been a fragrance that was really popular. I actually did a whole podcast episode talking about Chanel Number 5 and how it got started. But around Marilyn Monroe's time, she was the icon. And when she talked about Chanel Number 5 in that way, it was iconic. And it's to the point that the brand, even today, on their website, they have a recording of her interview and they talk about how she talked about Chanel Number 5. They reference it in their marketing. They tie Marilyn to Chanel Number 5 so explicitly, even today, decades later. And it's interesting that that was such an organic, or to us, it seems like a very organic interaction that ended up being iconic. And she later did a photo shoot, and Chanel Number 5 was on her nightstand, and I believe that was in her home. And again, it was like a very nonchalant way of showcasing her personality, her life, and she just had this fragrance just, hanging out while she was doing this photo shoot. So I thought that was really cool and interesting. Some other Hollywood celebrities that had ties to the fragrance industry were Audrey Hepburn. She was really associated with La Tortilla Givenchy. That's a really beautiful honeyed white floral fragrance. So I find that in my mind really aligns with like the femininity and the girlishness that Audrey Hepburn was known for. And then also I learned when I was doing some research for this episode that Grace Kelly was associated with Creed Florisimo. So she commissioned this custom fragrance from Creed for her wedding to the Prince of Monaco. And this linked Hollywood with royalty. And of course, this event with the association to Creed linked that whole episode with the fragrance itself and with the fragrance brand. And of course, you guys know how big of a fan I am of Elizabeth Taylor Passion. Now, Passion was one of the first fragrances created by celebrity Elizabeth Taylor. This was launched in 1987, I believe, and it was the first fragrance that she launched as a celebrity. Previous to this, it wasn't really common for celebrities to launch their own fragrances, but she did just that. It was supposed to be a daring, bright fragrance, basically epitomizing her personality, her who she was as a person. And you guys know how much I love it, and I always find that it frustrates me to no end when other content creators really like to insult that fragrance, because in my mind that fragrance represents old Hollywood. It's supposed to be a fragrance that represents a bygone era. It was created in the 1980s. Obviously, fragrances were completely different back then. And of course, perfumes go through various reformulations, as we are all aware of. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that not every single fragrance was created for a modern nose. So I love Passion by Elizabeth Taylor, of course. And then she also came out with her diamonds line. Now, if you don't know, Elizabeth Taylor was super into her diamonds. She was known for having probably one of the largest private collections of diamonds or diamond jewelry or just jewelry in general with gemstones in the world. And after her death, there was actually this, I believe it was a huge Christie's auction where all these pieces were auctioned off, and a lot of the jewelry brands that had been commissioned for these pieces ended up buying their pieces back, and now they are not going to part with them. I believe there's a necklace that's being held by Cartier, and they literally said we're never giving this to anyone. We're never selling it. It's priceless. It remains in our vault, which is really interesting. So she connected that love and that association that she had with gemstones and jewelry to her fragrances. And of course, now we have white diamonds. There's rubies. There are so many other fragrances in that line that she came out with. She came out with a bunch. I haven't smelled all of them, but I would love to one day. If you've tried those fragrances, definitely do let me know how they worked for you. And of course, we have to talk about fragrances and the relationship the celebrities had with them in the early 2000s. So celebrities like Paris Hilton and Britney Spears came out with their own celebrity fragrances. Of course, we have Britney Spears with Fantasy. She also launched Curious and many other flankers related to those fragrances. These were perfumes that were supposed to target a younger audience, her fan base, and they were a great hit. So, for example, the fantasy series had like a sweet gourmand DNA that was targeted to her younger fans, and this was a best-selling line. Eventually, she created over 30 fragrances, I believe, and those perfumes generated over 1.5 billion in sales, making her one of the most iconic celebrities to be associated with a fragrance line. And of course, we can't not talk about Paris Hilton as well. She is another fragrance powerhouse. She has launched many fragrances on her own as well, and she is still launching them to this day. She started off with Paris Hilton for Women in 2005, and this was supposed to be another fruity floral fragrance that was synonymous with her personality, with her aesthetic. And now she's had over 30 releases, and her fragrances have still continued to launch today. I would like to also bring up Rihanna. She had her own set of fragrances released in the early 2000s, but I think it's fascinating if we observe what she has been coming out with lately. She has only had one fragrance in recent times. That's the Fenty perfume that was launched in association with her beauty line. And I think it's interesting because she was one of the first celebrities to kind of shift and start exploring the fine fragrances realm. Because I don't know about you, but I definitely would not lump Fenty, the perfume, in with Britney Spears' Fantasy or the Paris Hilton fragrances. I think Fenty is definitely a step up, so it's fascinating to see the relationship, or rather the evolution of Rihanna's celebrity fragrances in the 2000s and what she's coming out with today in terms of the celebrity fragrance and beauty space. Fragrance has now been recognized as one of the fastest growing subsets of the beauty industry in the 2020s. And with that recognition comes a new influx of celebrity related fragrance launches. And I do think that with this influx, consumers are becoming more and more particular about what they spend their money on. And fragrance brands, when they're associating themselves with celebrities, now have a need to do it with more intention. So I'll give you an example. The Kardashians have been launching fragrances for ages, and Khloe Kardashian just launched their most recent fragrance, XO Khloe. Her marketing team did a really focused job on trying to make it look as if this was a passion project, when in reality it kind of came off as looking as a cash grab. Despite a lot of promotion, a lot of influencer attention, this fragrance kind of fell flat. It's one of those perfumes that's objectively nice smelling, but it's nothing new. Compare that to, for example, Arabella's Bella Hadid's line, and that fragrance brand seems much more successful and much more intentional and unique. And I think it's worth examining the difference between something that seems more genuine, like an Arabella or a Fenty, and something that seems like a cash grab, like a Kardashian fragrance or an Addison Rae perfume. And I think it's interesting comparing those two categories, because on one hand, you have fragrances that seem more well thought out, that have a lot of backing behind them to make the fragrances seem interesting, unique, and kind of clever. And then on the other hand, you have fragrances that seem as if they were created by a team of people really just focused on profit and nothing else, not as much on artistry, not as much on personality. They're just trying to pick out notes and promote notes that are meant to sell. And I think now more than ever, that kind of approach is falling flat. Of course, the beauty industry and fragrance in general has changed so much over the decades that we've been doing celebrity endorsements, but I do think it's fascinating when we look at where we started with Marilyn Monroe doing her number 5 promotion unintentionally, somehow nonchalantly, to where we are today with so many celebrities being associated with fragrances all over the world. Let me know if you want to hear more about celebrities and their associations with fragrance, and do share your preference about whether we should be focusing more on modern day celebrities and talking about the marketing behind those campaigns, or if we really want to dive deep into the old Hollywood aspect of the fragrance industry. Let me know what you want to see next. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye. This episode's music was brought to you by Kevin McLeod over at Incompetech. This is Beauty Flow by Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com and is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license.